What began as an ordinary Hollywood weekend ended as one of the most disturbing tragedies the industry has ever witnessed. Because on Sunday afternoon, December 14th, 2025, the legendary filmmaker Rob Reiner, the man behind The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally and A Few Good Men, and his wife, producer Michelle Singer Reiner, were found brutally killed inside their Brentwood, Los Angeles home, and within hours, police identified the suspect as someone no one wanted to believe could be capable of such an act. Their own son, Nick Reiner. But to understand how this horrifying story unfolded, investigators now say the timeline begins the night before, at a Christmas party hosted by Conan O'Brien, where multiple eyewitnesses later described a deeply unsettling confrontation between Rob Reiner and Nick that left guests shaken, because according to sources at the party, the argument between father and son was not quiet, not private, and not normal, as Nick allegedly became erratic, confrontational, and increasingly unstable, loudly arguing with his father while repeatedly asking guests whether they were famous, behavior that one attendee later described as freaking everyone out. So much so that Rob and Michelle reportedly left the party early, and no one there imagined it would be the last time they would ever be seen alive, because less than 24 hours later, at approximately 3:30 p.m. on Sunday, Los Angeles Fire Department responders were dispatched to the Reiner residence for what was initially described as a medical emergency, but when first responders entered the home, they found a 78-year-old man and a 68-year-old woman dead at the scene, their deaths immediately triggering a homicide investigation due to the circumstances. And sources later confirmed that it was the couple's daughter, Romy Reiner, who discovered their bodies, a detail that added another devastating layer to an already unbearable family tragedy. As detectives from the LAPD Robbery Homicide Division began combing through the house, searching for answers, while the Hollywood community remained completely unaware of what was unfolding behind the gates of the quiet Brentwood neighborhood. But the shock only deepened when police announced that Nick Reiner, age 32, was not at the house when the bodies were discovered, having allegedly left the home earlier that day, prompting an immediate search that led officers several miles away to the Exposition Park area near the University of Southern California, where Nick was located and taken into custody around 9:15 p.m., just hours after his parents were found dead. And as news of the arrest broke, law enforcement sources confirmed that Nick had been booked on 2 counts of murder and would be held without bail at Los Angeles' Twin Towers jail, with court proceedings scheduled to follow, while investigators worked to piece together what had happened inside the house during those missing hours. And as the headlines exploded across the world, the reaction was immediate and visceral, because Rob Reiner was not just another celebrity. He was Hollywood royalty, the son of comedy legend Carl Reiner, a defining voice of American cinema for over 5 decades, and a man who had spent his life telling stories about love, justice, friendship, and moral courage, making the reality of his death at the hands of his own child almost impossible for fans to process. But as detectives continued their investigation, disturbing details from Nick Reiner's past began resurfacing, raising painful questions about long-standing struggles that the family had tried for years to confront privately. And while police have not yet publicly detailed the method or motive behind the killings, multiple sources close to the case say the events of that Saturday night argument may now be viewed as a critical warning sign, one that tragically went unanswered, because what looked like a heated family dispute at a holiday party may have been the final public moment before a private nightmare unfolded behind closed doors, leaving 2 lives lost, a family shattered, and an industry in mourning. And as the investigation presses forward, one question hangs heavy over Hollywood and beyond. How did a story that once symbolized creative legacy and generational success descend into one of the darkest family crimes in modern celebrity history? Do you think the warning signs were already there? Or is this a tragedy no one could have stopped? Comment your thoughts below as investigators began searching for answers. Attention quickly turned toward a painful reality that the Reiner family had quietly battled for years, because long before the night Rob and Michelle were killed, their son Nick Reiner had been openly struggling with addiction, instability, and repeated cycles of recovery and relapse that stretched back to his teenage years, a story Nick himself had spoken about publicly in interviews and podcasts, revealing that his substance abuse began around the age of 15 and quickly escalated into a pattern of rehab admissions, emotional breakdowns, and periods of homelessness that forced him to drift between states, cut off from stability, and increasingly disconnected from the life his famous parents tried desperately to protect him from. And in a 2016 interview, Nick admitted that as his addiction deepened, he moved farther away from his family, both physically and emotionally, describing long stretches where he was living unhoused and cycling through treatment programs that never seemed to stick, while Rob and Michelle, by their own later admission, struggled with guilt, regret, and fear over how to help their son without enabling his self-destruction. A fear that became disturbingly real in 2018 when Nick described an incident on a podcast in which he said he had become totally spun out on meth and other stimulants and violently destroyed his parents' guest house, punching walls, smashing furniture, wrecking electronics, and losing all sense of logic or control. An episode that, in hindsight, reads like a flashing red warning sign of a deeper psychological unraveling, because Nick acknowledged that there was no reasoning behind his actions at the time and that his parents had told him he could no longer stay there. A moment that reportedly strained the family even further but did not sever it, as Rob and Michelle continued trying to help their son navigate recovery, including collaborating with him on the 2015 film Being Charlie, a deeply personal project that mirrored Nick's real-life battle with addiction and explored the complex, often painful dynamic between a famous father and a son drowning in substance abuse. A film that many now see as both a cry for help and a desperate attempt at healing through art. Yet despite these efforts, sources close to the family say Nick's struggles never truly disappeared, instead resurfacing in waves that left loved ones constantly bracing for the next crisis. And when viewed through this lens, the explosive argument at Conan O'Brien's party the night before the murders begins to feel less like an isolated incident and more like the culmination of years of unresolved tension, emotional exhaustion, and fear, as witnesses described Nick as erratic, agitated, and disconnected from reality, behavior that eerily echoed his past admissions of losing control during drug-fueled episodes. And while it remains unknown what Nick's mental state was in the final hours before his parents were killed, law enforcement sources now say that investigators are carefully examining his history of addiction, past violent behavior, and documented instability to determine how these long-standing issues may have intersected with the events of that weekend, because at the center of this tragedy is a devastating truth that many families recognize but few ever face at this scale: the unbearable helplessness of loving someone who is sick, watching them spiral, trying to save them again and again, only to discover too late that love, resources, and fame were not enough to stop the darkness from consuming everything in its path. Should families speak out more openly when a loved one shows dangerous warning signs? Or does that cross a line? Share your thoughts below. As news of Rob and Michelle Reiner's death spread, Hollywood didn't just mourn. It reeled, because the loss wasn't confined to cinema history. It struck at the heart of a community that had grown up with Rob Reiner's voice, values, and storytelling, and within hours, tributes began pouring in from friends, collaborators, and cultural figures who struggled to reconcile the image of a man synonymous with warmth and humanity with the brutality of his final moments. As Maria Shriver, a close friend and longtime neighbor of the Reiners, broke down publicly in an emotional tribute, revealing that she had shared dinner with Rob and Michelle just days before they were killed and describing them as being in the best place in their lives. Deeply in love, deeply committed to their family, and still hopeful about the future. Words that landed like a gut punch because they painted a picture not of a family in collapse, but of one still trying, still loving, still believing things could get better, while Jamie Lee Curtis and her husband Christopher Guest released a joint statement saying they were numb, sad, and shocked, urging the public to focus on the surviving children and grant the family privacy to grieve. And comedian Eric Idle added another haunting detail when he revealed that he had spoken with Rob Reiner on the phone just the night before his death for over an hour, calling him thoughtful, generous, and full of ideas about the future, making the suddenness of the tragedy feel even more cruel. But as heartfelt tributes filled social media, the morning was violently disrupted by a political shockwave no one saw coming, because less than 24 hours after the murders, President Donald Trump released a statement that stunned even his critics, suggesting that Rob Reiner's death was somehow linked to the anger he caused others through his outspoken opposition to Trump, language that many viewed not only as insensitive, but deeply dehumanizing in the face of an ongoing murder investigation, and when confronted by reporters in the Oval Office, Trump doubled down, stating bluntly that he wasn't a fan of Rob Reiner and reiterating long-standing grievances, comments that immediately ignited outrage across political and cultural lines, transforming a family tragedy into a national debate about decency, timing, and the weaponization of grief, prompting even Republican voices like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene to step in and publicly state that the deaths were not about politics, but a family tragedy rooted in addiction and mental health struggles, urging empathy rather than division, while Maria Shriver condemned the comments as inhumane, insisting that this moment demanded compassion, not political score-settling. And suddenly, the story of Rob Reiner's death existed in two parallel realities, one of sorrow, remembrance, and human loss, and another of bitter ideological warfare, as media outlets debated whether politics had any place in discussing such a deeply personal crime, even as the Reiner family issued a brief statement asking for privacy and confirming their heartbreak, a plea that struggled to cut through the noise of viral outrage, because Rob Reiner had never been a quiet figure politically, and in death, his activism became inseparable from the way his life was being publicly dissected, leaving many to question whether America had lost the ability to mourn without dividing itself. And as Hollywood attempted to honor a man whose films celebrated empathy, friendship, and moral courage, the very values Rob spent his career defending were now being tested in real time, turning his death into not just a criminal investigation, but a mirror reflecting how a nation responds to tragedy when grief collides with ideology. Should political leaders stay silent during active family tragedies? Or is public accountability always fair game? To understand why the death of Rob Reiner feels so profoundly destabilizing, you have to understand who Rob Reiner was beyond the headlines, beyond the crime scene, beyond the politics, because long before his name became attached to tragedy, it was synonymous with some of the most human, enduring, and emotionally honest stories ever put on screen, stories that shaped generations and quietly defined what American cinema looked like at its best. As the son of legendary comedian Carl Reiner, Rob grew up surrounded by creativity, humor, and a deep respect for craft, yet he never relied solely on inheritance, carving his own identity first as an actor playing the outspoken, argumentative Mike Meathead Stivic on All in the Family, a role that mirrored his real-life willingness to challenge authority and speak his mind, and that same courage followed him behind the camera, where he became one of the rare filmmakers trusted equally by critics, audiences, and actors, directing films that ranged from absurd satire like This Is Spinal Tap to coming-of-age heartbreak in Stand By Me, timeless romance in When Harry Met Sally, fairy tale optimism in The Princess Bride, courtroom intensity in A Few Good Men, and psychological terror in Misery. A filmography so diverse that it defied genre labels yet remained unmistakably personal, because at the core of every Rob Reiner film was the same belief: that people are complicated, flawed, sometimes broken, but still worthy of empathy, a belief that extended into his personal life, where friends described him as loyal, generous, deeply political but deeply human, a man who argued fiercely yet loved fiercely too, and perhaps nowhere was that contradiction more painfully visible than in his role as a father, because while Rob Reiner could shape stories with perfect structure on screen, real life offered no script, no clean resolution, especially when it came to watching his son Nick struggle with addiction, instability, and inner demons that neither fame nor resources could erase, a reality Rob himself had acknowledged in interviews, admitting that loving a child battling addiction forces parents to confront impossible choices, constant fear, and the haunting question of whether they are helping or hurting. And yet, even in that struggle, Rob and Michelle never stopped trying, never stopped showing up, never stopped believing recovery was possible, a fact repeatedly emphasized by friends like Maria Shriver, who described them as devoted parents to the very end, which is what makes the final days so unbearable to process, because by all accounts, Rob and Michelle were not isolated, not despairing, not withdrawn, but engaged, hopeful, still making plans, still seeing friends, still living fully, until suddenly they weren't. And that violent rupture is what turns this from a celebrity crime story into something far more unsettling, a reminder that tragedy does not always announce itself with warning sirens, that decades of love, creativity, and contribution can be eclipsed in a single irreversible moment, leaving behind questions that may never be fully answered. Yet even in death, Rob Reiner's legacy resists being reduced to how his life ended, because his work continues to speak. His films continue to comfort, inspire, and challenge. His voice continues through characters who remind us to stand up for what's right, to laugh at absurdity, to believe in love, and to fight cynicism with sincerity. And perhaps that is the cruel irony of this story, that a man who spent his career reminding the world of its shared humanity became the center of a tragedy that exposed how fragile that humanity truly is, how quickly compassion can give way to judgment, politics, or spectacle, which is why many of those closest to Rob Reiner have urged the public to remember him not through the lens of violence, but through the decades of meaning he created, the friendships he nurtured, and the art he left behind, art that will long outlive the headlines, the court dates, and the outrage cycles, because while investigations will conclude and debates will fade, the films will remain, playing in living rooms, classrooms, and hearts for generations to come, quietly reminding us of the man who believed stories could make people better, and in the end, that may be the most honest way to honor Rob Reiner. Not by letting his final chapter define him, but by remembering the life he lived, the love he gave, and the legacy that no tragedy can erase. If this story proves anything, it's that even the brightest creative legacies cannot shield families from pain, but they can leave behind light for the rest of us to hold on to.